All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's roundtable. I'm Janairy DelValle, Associate Registrar here at the museum. And this afternoon, I'm excited to be engaging a distinguished group of panelists about the term Latinx. There will be a questions and answer portion after the presentation. Please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom if you're joining us via Zoom, and in the comment section if you're joining via Facebook Live. To kick off today's discussion, I would like to share an artwork in our collection by Pepón Osorio. Next slide, please. This artwork is called Untitled, the barbershop chair and mouths from the installation En la barbería no se llora, no crying allowed in the barbershop. Osorio is a Puerto Rican artist of African descent who is best known for large-scale installations that portray political and social issues affecting Latin American communities in the United States. In this piece, he was inspired by his first haircut in Santurce, Puerto Rico. Osorio recreates the space of the barbershop as one that is intensely packed with masculine symbols, where he boldly challenges the idea of masculinity and particularly of machismo in Latin communities. Before we begin, allow me to give you a little introduction. Next slide, please. The definition of Latinx is a person of Latin American origin or descent, and the term is used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina. Next slide, please. A person considered Latina, Latino, or Latinx means your ancestors must have come from a Latin American country, for example, Mexico, Chile, Brazil. The term Latinx focuses on geography, whereas, for example, those who are considered Hispanic means you or your ancestors must have come from a Spanish-speaking country. Next slide, please. The exact origin of the term is unclear, but some researchers trace the term back to online LGBTQ communities, forums, and others have found early uses of the X in place of the gender O and A, dating back to the late 1990s. Spanish is linguistically a gender language, which is exactly why some people have begun to embrace the term Latinx because of its inclusive nature. In recent years, the term Latinx has gained popularity and it has been adopted by people who are looking for a more gender-free alternative to Latino or Latina to express their identity. However, the use of this term has created confusion and controversy within the Latin American community. Some people are in favor of using the term while others are against it, which is why we have invited this esteemed group of panelists who will be talking about their point of view on what is Latinx. Next slide, please. All right, so you can see a list of the panelists and their names, but let me introduce you personally. Hello, guys. Today's panelists are Rocio Aranda Alvarado. Rocio is a program officer in creative and free expression at the Ford Foundation. She's also an art historian and curator. In her work at Ford, Rocio has organized a number of regional meetings focusing on the lack of visibility for you as Latinx artists in the broader museum field and in the history of American art. Our second panelist is Oriana Eliza Gonzalez. Oriana is a second-generation Black Caribbean New Yorker of Cuban and Puerto Rican descent, who works as an independent researcher and museum professional. She holds a master's degree in liberal studies from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, where she focused on African studies, Latin American Caribbean, and Latino studies. Our third panelist is Gabriela Martinez. Gabriela is a Salvadorian and Nicaraguan Latina born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. For the past 3 years, she was an explorer within the Newark Museum of Art Explorers program, and it was through different internships and annual projects where she gained experience spanning leadership, public speaking, and community engagement. Today, she is a first-year political science major at the University of Southern California, upon graduating from Science Park High School in Newark. And our fourth panelist is Anthony Diaz. Anthony is a Newark native and the oldest of 4 brothers. He is currently the North Jersey organizer for Faith in New Jersey and a co-founder of the Newark Water Coalition. He believes that people's powers and the recognition of how all struggles are interconnected and are the key to winning this war on people. All right. So my first question to all the panelists is, what does Latinx means to you? And are you in favor or against it, and why? Let's start with Rocio.
Oh,
Hi, Rocio.
Hi, everyone. First, thank you to Janairy and Elena and the Newark Museum for inviting me to this. I'm so honored to be on this esteemed panel with these amazing thinkers. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because I've been having meetings, not about this term, but about the lack of visibility for US Latinx artists in the museum world overall. And so if you go to the next slide, oh wait, was this the time when I do my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. Next slide. Yes, this is perfect. Part of I think what's interesting about this conversation is that it's certainly not the first term to come along, and certainly not the first controversial term either. There are many people who were opposed to the term Latino initially as opposed to Hispanic. There's many people who still want to identify as Hispanic. And so I just put this slide up to show there's so many different ways of naming basically the same group that we're talking about. And I also want to point out that there is a kind of a power dynamic in that naming, since some of the names that were originally ascribed to our group were handed down from the federal government. There is purposeful confusion around terms, I think, that's created by the powers that be in order to subvert any power that we could have on our own, right? And so the next few slides, actually, you can just scroll through. I really put them in just to show how the word is controversial, because every week, if you go to the next 2 or 3 slides, just pause on them briefly, it just shows how there are people that embrace the term Latinx, and there are people who are really very much against it. Literally every week, if you just put a Google reminder, it'll send you an article about the term Latinx and whether it's good or bad and who's embracing it and who's rejecting it. This is Ed Morales's early article about how he embraced the term, and obviously he's used it in his book title, so he's all for it. He had a great talk at the Whitney a couple weeks ago about the book. Let's see, the next slide I think shows, oh, this is interesting to me, the argument that Latinx cannot be used in proper Spanish, which is untrue. Actually, if you watch news from Latin America, there are ways of speaking that are inclusive and include all genders and non-binary people. We say ellas, and we say, what's another example? Anyway, ellas is the one that comes to mind immediately, but in placing the X where there would be normally an A or an O, colegas instead of, that kind of thing. So next slide shows, again, a lot of articles around the origin of the word Latinx. The following slide is, I think, one of the best illustrated examples written by a cartoonist. That's fantastic explanation of the word, and really illustrates how we use it in the United States much more than you would use it in the rest of the country. Because when I use the term Latinx, I'm talking about a US population with a US experience. And so the next slide, I just want to go through a couple of things. Shows how, for example, some museums have already embraced it. So the Bedes Art Museum in Miami had a 2-day event that looked around the term Latinx and looking at Latinx art specifically. And there was a lot of controversy. There are many people who do not embrace the term, including artists themselves. I think the most important thing is that people should self-identify rather than be put into a category that they are not comfortable with. So the next slides just show a little bit about some statistics, because I think the other thing that leads to this confusion is, I think people in the US, Anglos especially, do not understand the difference between a Latin American and a US Latinx. And so some statistics, if you go to the next slide, it shows the percentage. First of all, that we already know that there's a population boom among Latinos in the US, and that the next slide, if you go to the next slide, it shows really that were mostly born in the United States. This is really important. One of the things I said when I was writing about the Biennial for El Museo in 2013 is that most of the artists that we were showing in the exhibition were born in the United States. It's American art that we're talking about, right? It's not Latin American art. And these artists should be incorporated into the history of US art. The next slide shows how many Latinos are actually English dominant. which is important because I think that when people see names that look foreign and sound foreign, they make assumptions about us, about our level of education, about whether we speak English or not. And then I think the last slide, oh no, this is just another slide that introduces the idea about the invisibility in Latinx museums, actually. So you can just skip one and go to the following slide. I just have two slides here that show the lack of visibility for US Latinos among major surveys of Latin American art in museums. So this is a perfect example of the MoMA exhibition from 1992 that completely ignored any US presence. And then a more recent show from 2004, again, not a single word about artists living and working in the US. The next slide is an example of a more recent exhibition that does make an effort to show how many Latin American women were in the show versus how many US Latinas were in the show. So getting a little better, but still not a real presence. And then the last comments I'll make is just about the history of exhibitions. So we have an invisibility problem because there's been very few exhibitions that show a survey of US Latino art as part of American art or even on its own, with its own history. So here's some early examples. Canadian Club did some early traveling shows that went around the country. The next slide shows an early example from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston that was called Hispanic Art in the United States. And then the most, I think, interesting show, important show because it was done by people from the community, as the next slide, a show called Chicano Art, Resistance and Affirmation from the mid-1990s. That was the first show of its kind. And then the final slide just shows some of the younger, let's say, focused exhibition like the S-Files or Phantom Sightings, which really looks at contemporary artists who are doing work today. And then we don't need to show the rest of the slides because of course I want us all to have a conversation, but it's just a little bit more information about the lack of diversity in the museum world and the lack of diversity in exhibitions, I think contributes to this problem of misunderstanding. Thank you.
All right. Let's continue with Oriana. What does Latinx mean to you?
Hi, everyone. I also want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really honored to be in conversation with all of you. So piggybacking on Rocio, when I think about Latinx, I really appreciate this idea of it being an invitation to question language and have a conversation, which is something I read in a 2017 article in Chiricu Journal called What's in an X by Catalina and Leonis. And in that article, just like we're doing here, a group of 5 scholars who focus on language, sexuality, gender, and Latinidad from the US and Puerto Rico, they went in a Google Doc and they just debated the term. And I also use the term primarily when I'm focusing on people groups of Latin American heritage in a US context. And when I use the term, it's in an effort to respect our diverse intersecting identities, so race, class, nationality, sexualities. And when I see it being used, it prompts me to consider who is or who is not included in this conversation. So who's got a seat at this table, and even more importantly, who does not? Because many conversations about Latinidad are overwhelmingly catered to whiteness and cisness and other systemic privileges. So using the word, it can be an active embrace of each other's differences. And it can also help us remember that Latinxes are not monolithic anywhere. We are multicultural and multiracial and multi-ethnic and can absolutely be non-binary and queer. And while I use the term when I'm referring to other individuals and groups who share Latin American heritage, I don't use it when I'm referring to myself because on one hand, I don't identify as non-binary. I use she, her pronouns and recognize my privilege as a cis woman. And then on the other hand, I've been specific when naming myself for most of my life as a Black woman with Caribbean roots. So coming back to Latinx, I think the strength and limitations of the term are in the invitation of possibilities and choices that it brings about. And more importantly, how we choose to move forward with those possibilities. So when we choose it and we're choosing to be gender neutral in order to expand our conversations, how are we giving voice to the diverse lived experiences of Latinxes in the US? And more importantly, how are we committing to honoring and inviting and fostering safe spaces for and with queer, trans, and non-binary folks? And then also, what actions are we going to take after we say Latinx? Like, how do we go beyond language to amplify marginalized voices? And how are we actively working to question and dismantle the oppressive powers that are endangering their lives?
All right. How about you, Gabriella?
Yeah, I believe Latinx encompasses the diversity of genders and sexualities of people who identify with Latinidad as an ethnic identity. And I believe this is necessary in order to have an inclusive community for everyone. Latinx also challenges the ideologies of language, culture, and gender. And at the same time, it allows us to recognize the importance of the intersectionality of social identities, which ultimately, I believe, is necessary in a society that is constantly evolving and changing over time.
Well, so those are three acts, very hard to follow. And thank you for all of that. And thank you for allowing me to share this space with you. So I think ultimately it's Latinx is a way for the disenfranchised to seize power. And what's so interesting is, just thinking about it, especially with Rocio's presentation, it made me think about how words need to evolve with the times, right? Some people like to think that we're trying to force everything with a new label and trying to change up society, but the very world around us is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And we need language that is reflective of that change. And so, often these labels are given to us, and this is a very, very real way for us to seize language and use it and take that power back. And that's how I see it.
All right. Our next question is, why is this term so controversial? I know Rocio touched a little bit about that. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to share their thoughts.
I can go.
Yeah.
So the controversy I hear most often, like Rocio touched on, is that Latinx cannot be pronounced in Spanish. And I'll echo what lots of scholars, artists, activists, journalists, and community members have been saying about this, that Spanish is a language, as many of us know, that's been imposed through processes of European colonization and the enslavement of Black and Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And while yes, historically, there have been many social movements to fight for the right of Latinxes and immigrants in the US to speak Spanish in public and private spaces, and I recognize the importance of those movements, Spanish shouldn't also be a requirement for identifying as Latinx, especially in the US. And it shouldn't be like disqualify or qualify someone as a person who's thought of in the idea of Latinidad. Because first of all, Latinxes speak other languages everywhere, in particular, indigenous languages like Garifuna in Central America, Quechua in Peru, and Nahuatl in Spanish in Mexico. And a 2016 Pew Research Center study reported that Latinx youth, who, like Rocio said too, are the majority of the rapidly growing US Latinx population, 41% were English dominant, 40% bilingual, and just 19% Spanish dominant. So those numbers clearly show us that Spanish isn't the foundation of all Latin American, Caribbean, and Central American heritages. I, for one, don't speak Spanish fluently. I say that I mostly speak Spanglish, and that's still really bad. Another controversy among the many is that lots of Afro-Latinxes in the US reject the term Latinx because they feel it doesn't embrace us and our Blackness. Recently in Vice, about 2 weeks ago, Afro-Latina Garifuna writer Janelle Martinez interviewed 3 Black diasporans about their take on the term, and many of them said they don't feel represented by Latinx or even the whole concept of Latinidad because it first and foremost assumes whiteness. So Black Latin American immigrants and US-born Afro-Latinxes need to be recognized when we're thinking about this term and considered within the concept of Latinidad. And these controversies, I think what it really importantly shows us is that who Latinx might exclude and include, and also how it mirrors, how the language we use mirrors the privileges we do or don't carry. So I think it's important for us to think about whether we reject Latinx because it doesn't include us or because we're unwilling to make ourselves comfortable to include others.
Very good. All right, our next question is, what are some of the misconceptions of the use of the term Latinx? Rocio, would you like to share something?
I think the first thing I always say when I'm speaking about the term is to clarify that I'm speaking about a US population. I have heard people use it to mean the rest of the Americas. And the reason I think it's an important distinction is exactly the example I gave when I was writing for an exhibition at El Museo del Barrio. Most of the artists were born in the US. And one of the things I always say also is Latinx art is American art. That is, the rest of the Americas has a different relationship to the larger art world than US Latinos embedded in the US do. That is, there is a market, there are collectors, and there are pathways for artists in Latin America to have careers at a level that US Latinx artists do not enjoy yet. There's a teeny tiny handful, and I think it's only sort of people who really in the know understand the significance of the handful of Latinx artists who have that kind of a career possibility. So I think the fact that it's a US experience is really important. We're talking about how Oriana was mentioning, many people were forced to not speak Spanish, right, or were punished. This is Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans also early on. Many Puerto Ricans changed their names in New York. So if you're doing research on an artist who was active in the 50s and 60s, sometimes you have to research their Anglo name and their Spanish name, because there was a desire to sort of assimilate. And one of the ways that was done was by, reducing difference, i.e. your name and your language. And so I think the distinction is important. We're talking about a US population that's dealt with US racism and the history of that racism in the United States, being thought of as foreigners and immigrants, despite the fact that we've been here for over 400 years.
Interesting. Gabriela, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so Latinx is a term that has definitely gained popularity through social media and recently on college campuses in the past few years. And being that it is relatively new, there are many misconceptions and confusion around the term. And in some instances, it is completely unknown. And based on research, much conversation around the term has taken place in institutions of higher education, which has also become a barrier for those who do not have access to higher education. And as a result, there is the need for future research that continues to explore the sentiments regarding the term Latinx within all communities of people. But a major misconception of the use of the term Latinx that I did come across is that it would replace the terms Latino or Latina, deeply rooted in tradition. At the same time, I believe Latinx is not taking away someone's identity or taking away a tradition that has been around for so long, but it is about giving everyone the opportunity to identify and creating a new tradition within the community.
All right. Let's see here. So how do you feel about the term Latinx being used to talk about the whole Latin American community in the US? Anthony, would you like to share?
Yes, well, it bothers me. It bothers me a lot because, first of all, I'm not a big believer in identity politics as a whole. And to try to encompass every culture under one term is like a disservice. It's a huge disservice. There's such a beauty and heritage in our individual, countries, homes, communities, that you really can't do that, right? One of the tangible examples I use all the time is, as an El Salvadorian, like horchata is our big thing. However, Mexican horchata is my favorite, which is almost like blasphemy in my family. But, you know, it's these small nuances that I think, you know, we kind of lose when we try to bundle everything up under one umbrella, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for any community, and especially a community, an indigenous community that's so deeply connected and has a rich history and connected to land and connected to just, you know, all these different things. So that's the aspect of it that does bother me.
All right. Gabriella, would you like to add anything to that?
Based on my own experiences, being a part of Generation Z has been very empowering and enlightening. And my generation has had ample opportunity to learn beyond the classroom and through the internet and social media. And so I believe that this exposure at such a young age has allowed us to consider multiple perspectives and realities, and is why we have become so vocal and open to new ideas. I believe using the term Latinx to talk about the Latin American community as a whole in the US is a very complex conversation. And so when I think about using the term, I believe it's part of a bigger conversation. It is part of acknowledging that social norms evolve over time, and with that, language and communication evolve over time as well. And I also believe that it is part of educating others and having these conversations in order to understand their importance. And in challenging everything we have ever known, that is the only way we can progress as a society. And in truly understanding Latinx, that allows us to progress and become a more inclusive society.
All right, beautifully put. Our next question is, should this term be adopted to describe the nation's Hispanic or Latino population? Rocio, would you like to share your thoughts?
As I said before, I think people should self-identify. That's the most important thing to me, self-identify. You know, identity is fluid. There are people who still prefer to use the word Hispanic or Hispano to describe themselves, and it's practically impossible to use one term to encompass, you know, an entire population that is so different, that all came to the United States at different periods, almost all because of some kind of US military intervention into their own countries, to be honest, right? But we have different experiences nonetheless. So it's impossible, really. And so I think it can be useful for helping us to empower ourselves in some way, to find one another and to make, you know, group advances in a way, but not so useful as it flattens the differences between all of us.
All right, Gabriella.
Yeah, kind of going off of Rocio, there is not a simple answer for this. The Latino community is deeply rooted in tradition, and I also believe it's hard to adopt a term that some within the community can identify with because they may be unaware of its origins and because it has been such a strong tradition. However, I also believe Latinx has provided the opportunity for everyone to feel seen. And it is a multi-layered conversation. And quite honestly, I don't believe that it ends with this roundtable here. Through these conversations, one can be challenged, confront fears, and refute these stereotypes of social identities other than your own. The term Latinx is a meaningful and transformative word that promotes gender inclusivity and thus a respect for basic human dignity. I also believe that positionality plays a major role in the acceptance of the term, positionality being a form of sharing personal narratives as they relate to one's own social identities and beliefs and values. And through a deeper understanding and awareness of the complexities of the term Latinx, that requires a willingness to consider one's positionality and reflect on one's own beliefs. And I think that it's only through these conversations and opportunities for self-reflection in which we can truly progress together and as a society.
All right. Our next question is, do you think this term encompasses the diaspora? Oriana, what do you think?
Thank you, Gabriela, for mentioning personal narratives and positionality. I think that's so important when we're talking about any kind of identity label. And when prepping for this panel, I did ask a couple of my friends how they feel about the term Latinx and why or why not they identify with it. So I want to share some of their responses. My friend Cindy, who's Black and Dominican, a grad student from the Bronx, she said, I don't feel 100% comfortable saying Latinx in front of an older crowd, just because I don't care to educate them on why I use the term, nor do I have the emotional capacity to debate on the grammar of La Real Academia de España with people who are not open-minded or don't care about the experiences of others. My friend Nina, who's Black, Dominican, and Haitian from Brooklyn, she said, I would say I normally don't say I'm Latinx unless asked, because usually I feel like people assume I'm lying or they interrogate or exotify me. So it always felt like more trouble and attention than I wanted. And finally, my friend Catherine Feliz, who's a Black artist and organizer from Harlem with Dominican roots, she said, Latinidad always felt like a white exclusive club that I would never be granted access to as a Black person. There's always these gatekeeping questions that I got used to answering that I'm sure lighter skinned people never got asked. Like people would ask her, are both of your parents from there? It served to remind me that I didn't belong. And I wanted to share their experiences because as Black women with Caribbean heritage from New York who also embrace rejecting gender binaries, Latinx still erases them and is really exclusive of them and their experiences, even while they are interested in challenging, questioning the word Latinx and the ways it's trying to be inclusive. So I think while we're using this word, we really just have to be mindful of who it's bringing in and who it's really rejecting.
All right. How about you, Rocio?
I was just thinking about when Oriana was talking how there have been similar discussions around the term Chicano, just as an example, where people from Texas would be like, I'm not Chicano, I'm Tejano. Or I'm Tejana, you know, so that personal story, that way that you feel, the way that you identify, also can be an intervention into a term that's more broadly accepted and embraced, even by sort of more radical Mexican Americans who want to identify as Chicano.
All right, and I think we have one last question before we move on to allowing the audience to share their questions. Does the term Latinx prioritize equity? Who would like to take that one first?
I'll just say really quick that one of the reasons I do embrace the term, but that I don't expect other people to use it if they're uncomfortable with it, is for me, it's not just its inclusivity in terms of non-gender conforming folks, but it's a feminist term too. And this is the thing that's important to me. And part of it is like, I will acknowledge also that Spanish is not my first language. And so, and I'm not a linguist either, but when I learned as a young child that if there's a group of people sitting around a table and there's 15 of them who are women and one who's a man, they're still going to be ellos. And that seemed to me outrageous. And so to me, it's sort of like a feminist response to the patriarchy of the Spanish language, which no one can deny. That doesn't happen just by accident. Oh, that all of a sudden the whole group is referred to in the masculine, even though half of them are women. You know, that doesn't happen by accident. So I embrace it as a feminist also, because I love those interventions into the Real Academia and their ridiculous rules. So I think it's another way to sort of, you know, respond to the hegemony of language.
All right. What do you think, Gabriela?
I think the term Latinx allows for everyone to feel seen, and Latinx has evolved as a new form of liberation for people of Latin American descent who hold nonconforming gender identities, and it is inclusive in that it recognizes the intersectionality of sexuality, language, ethnicity, culture, geography, and phenotype. And it is very complex and it is a very multi-layered term, but it is important, and it's very difficult to feel represented with terms that one simply cannot identify with. And that's why I feel as though Latinx is so necessary.
All right. How about you, Oriana?
Well, I think language, right, is a step toward justice, but it's not the ultimate goal. So if we're thinking about equity versus equality, so presumably leveling the playing field for disenfranchised people, again, we need to think about who is saying Latinx, how and why. And when thinking about this question, I thought about this slogan, Latinx is for Black Lives, that's been used in the uprisings this summer. And Dr. Pablo C. Lopez Oro, who's a Black conductor from the New Yorker and a professor at Smith College, had a viral tweet this summer about how this slogan erases Black Latinxes. And I think the point of this slogan, right, was to promote equity, right? Like you go to a protest and you presumably are trying to push for social and political change, but in the same step, that sign, like the words on the sign, erase people. So I think it's very complicated. There are lots of different responses. When thinking about Afro-Latinx too, and I know I had this conversation with Janairy when we talked first about the panel, like when I've seen it used in media, I've seen it used to identify trans Afro-Latinas like Leilene Extravaganza Kubila Polanco, a Black New Yorker of Dominican heritage who unjustly and unlawfully died in Rikers due to gross negligence from our justice system, or MJ Rodriguez, who's from New Jersey and is Puerto Rican and African American, is on the TV show Pose. So, I mean, I think there are lots of different answers to this question, but most importantly, it's like, what are our intentions with choosing Latinx over Latina, Latino, or specifically naming someone's identity?
All right, beautiful. Thank you all for joining me today in this roundtable. I'm also very happy to have had this opportunity to listen to your point of view, to have had this conversation. And I agree with everybody that this is a complex conversation, and I'm just happy that it's happening, because these conversations need to happen for us to understand the complexity. All right, let's see. Now we want to ask the audience, have you heard of the term Latinx? You will see the question pop up in your screen in a few seconds. Feel free to answer. While you answer, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below if you're on Zoom, and in the comment section if you're joining via Facebook Live. All right. Let's see here. Wow, 87% answer yes. That's good. Okay. Let's see, we have a few questions from the audience already. I think we covered this one, but the first question is from Nicole Bauer. All right. So Latinx is US only term. Then what are you using for Latinas or Latinos in Latin America? Who would like to answer that question?
I think a lot of what Rocio said at the very beginning is crucial or vital to this whole entire conversation. It's very important for people to self-identify. So, you know, it's literally giving them the power to choose how they want to be seen. So, you know, I wouldn't say that I would throw a label on them, but see what community I'm talking about. And if I'm talking about a community, you should already make sure that there's communication there so that you can identify them correctly. But it needs to, you know, that's a conversation, and they need to be able to self-identify.
All right. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. What do you tell language purists who say that Latinx is not a real word and or construct?
I think this is an interesting question, because when I was thinking about this whole idea of like, oh, it doesn't fit in Spanish, it makes me think of how we all speak Spanish so differently across Latin America. Like even like Puerto Rican Spanish is like its whole thing. Dominican Spanish, like, you know, people are always like, I don't understand Dominicans. You know, we do things to language that are very specific to our like geographies, to our lived experiences. So I think this question, like, of purists, like, I kind of just wanna, this is not a great way to say it, but like throw it in the garbage, because it's like we use language in ways that fit our individual lives, like Gabriela was saying, like that come from our positionalities and our personal narratives. So use the word that you want to use that fits you best.
I want to throw in that words themselves are like English, right? If you look at English regionally, how it varies across this country. So when you think about words themselves, it's like, what really is a word? And then you throw slang in there, and then you throw like, you know, Ebonics, and just like, I know pronouncing Newark versus New York is a conversation I have all the time. So thinking about words, all words are constructs. And you really, really have to, you know, have that kind of larger conversation, even when looking at this, this phrase.
All right. Our next question is an anonymous attendee also. Latinx encompasses the diaspora. The X is a symbol of other identities not represented. What do you tell friends and family who identify as Afro-Latino or Latina, but reject Latinx? Who wants to jump in? All right.
Well, I don't know what I would tell them. I guess I think I don't know if this is exactly related, but I really appreciated what you said, Gabriela, about Generation X, and like how having the internet has made you appreciate different perspectives so much more. So I think part of that is like the benefit of having conversations with people, and like maybe with that family member just initiating a conversation about why exactly they want to reject that term, because I think even if at the end like you don't sway them to your side, it's important to be able to hear where each other is coming from.
All right, thank you, Ariana. Our next question is from Chanda. How do you feel when someone labels you a Latinx?
It makes me feel young and cool.
All right. Our next question is from Irene. Are there any upcoming exhibitions or projects about Latinx art and culture we should look out for? Which curators are focused supporting on Latinx art and culture? Maybe Rocio can answer this one.
Yeah, I have a few things actually to watch out for. First of all, a professor in this anthropology department at New York University, Arlene Davila, has founded the Latinx Project at NYU, and they host a series of amazing talks, interviews with artists, exhibitions featuring Latinx artists, US Latinx artists. And she's got a whole battery of programs that are going on in the fall and then in the spring. Over the next 5 years, there'll be a lot to look for there. But in terms of exhibitions specifically, there's two to look out for. In March of 2021, El Museo del Barrio is opening their survey of contemporary Latinx art. It was founded, the exhibition really started in the late 1990s, and initially was going to be an annual exhibition of contemporary US Latinx artists working in the United States. Actually, it was specifically for New York. The reason it was founded, I'll just tell a brief history, is that there are like at least 6 different exhibitions in New York City alone that are periodic and that look at contemporary artists who are living and working in New York. Studio Museum has one, the Whitney Biennial is another example. PS1 has one every 5 years. The New Museum has one every 3 years. They call it their triennial. So the S-Files at El Museo was founded in order to give space for US Latinx artists who were not being included in any of these shows, by the way, and I have the numbers to prove it. And so they created that exhibition. It became eventually biennial. And now, because those shows are a lot of work, it's going to be a triennial, but this time it's moving national. So there will be US Latinx artists from all over the country included in this show. They've already started some of the work leading up to it. So if you go on the El Museo website, there's some really interesting talks that have already happened, but it's opening in March. And then also next year, I think maybe also in the spring, Brick Art House in downtown Brooklyn is opening an exhibition of Latinx abstraction, which is really interesting and I think important because, especially because of this, the fact that well-known, well-established, well-funded artists from Latin America have been always associated with geometric abstraction, and particularly as it refers to them embracing very European concepts of what good art is. And so have been upheld as kind of like these models of Latin American art. But actually US Latinos here in the United States were also doing abstraction, not for any other reason except that it was the thing to do. You know, you went to art school in 1957 and you made paintings like Jackson Pollock. Or if you went in the 60s, you started making minimalist abstract hard edge paintings, right? So there is a history of that is practically unknown. And there are many younger artists who have adapted geometric abstraction. So it's going to be a really great show at Brick in Brooklyn.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Our next question is from Arthur. I read an article that contemporary Latinx scholars are now referring to previous article titles that use Latino and Hispanic in them, essentially renaming published articles. I don't think it's right if this is the case. Did anyone else hear of this example? No?
I hadn't heard that.
Nobody has heard it.
Scary though, that should not happen. That's like
All right.
the archives erasing signage from protest imagery. I mean, that should just not happen. I hadn't heard it though. I hope it's false.
I think this is more of a comment from Jonathan. We include both Latin American and Latinx artists in our American galleries at the Museum of Art, in wall texts identified by birthplace, where they live and work, or place of death. For classification internally, can Latin American encompass Latinx in this scenario, or would you distinguish one from the other? Great conversation. Thank you so much. I guess the question is, would you distinguish them from the others? I guess they mean Latin American artists born outside of the US, between those born in the US.
I think if we're talking about artists in a US context, I feel mixed about calling all of them Latin American. Like, I wouldn't call a US Latinx or Latino, Latina artist Latin American, because I think that erases their US born context, and also all of the kind of contentions within that about how Latin, like Rosie was saying, a lot of Latin American artists, that they have clearer pathways and they have different privileges that US born artists are kind of erased from in the art world. So I think it is important to distinguish them. I don't know necessarily if you need to use Latinx. I think that's needing to kind of think about your institutional values, maybe.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you,
is a really great question. Can I just jump in really quick? Because I do think it's
Yes.
important. One of the hashtags that I used all the time, I've used all the time, is Latinx art is American art, because we're talking about artists who are born in the US. That means they went to art school here. That means that they learned that pantheon of who the great artists were, especially US based artists. Many of them were their teachers. So they have a conversation with the history of US art. And so I think it's important to group them with the American artists, being clear that they're from a family that immigrated or who has been, or in the case of Mexican Americans who've been in the United States for a long time but are of Latin American heritage.
All right. There is another question. Anonymous source, any recommendation to museums and how they might better represent the Latinx community in their collection and exhibitions?
I guess, does that mean, for me, you know, from outside the museum world, I guess it's representative of what your staff looks like. If you don't have the right staff, you're not having the right conversations and you're not looking in the right places.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Okay, next question is anonymous source. What resources, if any, would you recommend to help understand the nuance that the term Latinx poses?
I think the best resource right now is Ed Morales's book, Latinx. The subtitle is something like, it's something about the politics of Latino communities in the United States. I can't remember the subtitle, but if you look up Ed Morales and Latinx, that's the sort of main book right now. And then Arlene Davila, the same professor who I mentioned from NYU, has a book about Latinx art. It's not an art history book per se, like talking about the history of that art, but it is about things like the market and the invisibilization of US Latinx artists within American art history. So it's a really interesting read.
I think too, I want to echo Arlene Davila's book because she talks about national privilege, which I think is really important, thinking about that distinction between Latin American and Latinx. And I recently was reading E. Carmen Ramos's catalog from the show, I might be messing up the name, Our America. And that is an incredible catalog. She doesn't use the word Latinx, but it's talking about US Latino artists.
Thank you both. All right, and our last question, how do you feel when someone says that Latinx is just for white Latin Americans? Nobody wants to say
It's
anything?
not just for white Latin Americans. I think I've said this a lot in my responses, but as someone who is not white, who is Black, and has Latin American heritage, Caribbean specifically, like, I think that is, to be honest, a racist thing to say.
All right, thank you so much. I'm just going to say this last comment from Franz Garrido. Thanks, everyone. I think you provided clarification, yet raising even more questions. A good beginning to a deeper conversation. And I have to agree. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a great conversation. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. Please join us next Thursday, October 1st at 7 p.m. for Stories of Us, film panel and screening. All right, goodbye and thank you for watching.
Thank you. Thank you all.
This was fun, and y'all are dope.
Yes.
So amazing.
Thank you.
So amazing.